the Wailers were rehearsing and the gunmen poked their guns through the door and just fired indiscriminately. The moment when he invited two political heads onto the stage and he joined their hands above his head, I mean, that was probably the most iconic moment in reggae history and of Marley's entire career.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of Bob Marley. Bob Marley was a widely recognizable global figure who transcended the music industry, first by writing songs that commented on the challenged social condition of his fellow citizens, and then through his active political participation and advocacy to better those people's lives. Bob was born in very humble beginnings in Jamaica in 1945, and as you'll hear today, through incredible hard work, he became a global music superstar, synonymous with reggae and the religion of Rastafarianism. But what you'll also hear may surprise you, as his musical career began in a very different musical genre, and his life as a Rasta came about in a surprising twist. Here to discuss the Bob Marley story is John Masouri. John is a highly acclaimed author and music journalist, specializing in reggae and dancehall genres. For more than 35 years, he's interviewed and written about many of these genres' most influential figures like Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, and others. His book, entitled Simmer Down, is a definitive text of the emergence of Bob Marley from his earliest days as a child to his status as a political force of music. John's work has appeared in Music Week, The Guardian Observer, and New Musical Express. John joins us today from the Brighton area in the UK. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums, John.
Thank you, Dave. I really appreciate the line of questioning that you take, and very professional, and I'm impressed.
Well, thank you very much for those kind words. When did you first start listening to sort of the Jamaican music? How did you come onto it?
I was 11 years old, and I was watching black and white television, a show called Ready, Steady, Go, and Millie was singing My Boy Lollipop, and she was my first crush. And
very good.
I came from a part of Nottingham where some of the early Caribbean migrants went to live. And so it was pretty multicultural in Nottingham, in the Midlands. And so members of what's called the Windrush generation who came over post-war, I knew people of that generation, and they were welcoming to me as a schoolboy and so on. And I went to Caribbean house parties when I was a schoolboy, and where we heard this music. I had no idea what I was listening to, but I sure as hell liked it. So I was born at the right time, Dave, essentially.
Today we're going to talk about an extraordinary figure, Bob Marley. And I wanted to just ask you to set the stage for the audience, if you would, and painting a picture of an extraordinary man that we're talking about today. As a starting point, there's a very telling quote from your book, Simmer Down, which is a great book. Mm-hmm. And in it, Bob is quoted as saying, quote, "Our music deals with reality, the half that has never been told," unquote. I think that's a powerful statement and sort of paints a picture of the multifaceted Bob. How about getting your input into that sort of figure and what you think of Bob as you look back now?
Well, he said half the story's been told, but his music's gone all around the world. So I think it's probably more like 3/4 has been told now. But, well, he's the king of reggae. I mean, he's a global icon who most clearly defines the reggae genre, and he's done the most to promote Jamaican music and culture around the world. He's also become the leading advocate of Rastafari and ganja smoking, and he should definitely have been honored as a Jamaican national hero by now, I feel. That's because his popularity and integrity, both as a spiritual leader and as a musician, are unparalleled. And no matter where you come from or your status in life, you can live by the messages in his music. Having said that, I don't believe he was a prophet. I believe he was a real human being with faults, like the rest of us. And I regard his achievements as being even more great as a result of that. Yeah.
Very good. That's an apt description of a very complex man. Let's go back in time and establish the life of Bob Marley and get a sense for where he's from, his family life, because I think that infuses the picture of the man that we ultimately see. Can you give us a sort of a sense of when he was born, where he was born, and what his family life was like?
Yes, he was born on February the 6th, 1945. His mother, Cedella Malcolm, was just 18 when she gave birth to him in a hamlet called 9 Miles in the parish of St. Anne in Jamaica. And she was a country girl, but the baby's father, Norval Marley, was 64 years old when she gave birth to Robert Nestor. And he was Jamaican, a white Jamaican, but he was born to a British father and a Jamaican mother. He served in the West Indies Regiment and was discharged as a private. He wasn't a captain, as has been reported elsewhere. He was well traveled. He'd been to Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, Cuba. So he was a worldly individual, but probably a bit of a rogue. He'd been supervising the clearance of land in St. Anne's, ready for building housing for war veterans. But he wasn't wealthy, and he allegedly died in poverty.
But his father, Norval, returns to his life at some point and leaves an impact.
About 10 years after Bob Marley was born. And he had very little to do with his son until Bob was 5 years old. And then Norval contacted Cedella and said that he would like to help with the boy's education and to put him on a bus to Kingston where his father would meet him and see to his schooling. And apparently what happened was that he didn't meet the child off the bus, but he put him in the care of an elderly spinster in quite a rough part of Kingston called Miss Gray, and left him there. And so the 5-year-old was pretty much left to roam the streets in one of the most deprived areas of central Kingston. And we can only imagine what that could have been like, especially as Bob was mixed race. And, you know, the thing about racism is that it's universal. You know, every nationality has its racists, and Jamaica's no exception. So he would have got some harsh treatment on the streets, even as an infant, because of his very light skin color.
And so how did this resolve with Bob at age 5 in the hands of this spinster and roaming the rough streets as a mixed-race child?
It wasn't until nearly 2 years later that his mother heard from a friend that she'd seen Bob, or Nesta, as he was called, roaming the streets in Kingston. And so his mother got on a bus and went to Kingston and found him and took him back to 9 Mile.
Not long after this, fate intervenes, and Bob Marley meets at a very young age a man that will become an instrumental member of his band, a certain Bunny Livingston, who would ultimately change his name to Bunny Wailer and become a contributing writer and performer on Wailer's songs.
It was when he was probably around 11 that a man called Thaddeus Livingston, whose nickname was Toddy, moved to 9 Mile with his 9-year-old son, Neville, who was nickname was Bunny. And he and Bob became firm friends, and Bunny would later become Bunny Wailer, of course.
Sure. He becomes a key figure in the Bob Marley story as one of the Wailers with Bob. So interesting. Exactly. Now, they were were they stepbrothers, or were they?
Well, eventually, because the thing is that Bunny was quite frail. The climate of St. Anne's, which was quite damp, misty, it wasn't like Kingston, didn't suit him. And so he only spent about a year in St. Anne before his father and Bob's mother moved to Trenchtown, and first they lived on First Street, and then they moved into a government yard in Second Street, which is where pretty much they grew up from there on.
So to recap, we've got Bob born in 9 Mile, which is what, 2.5 hours from Kingston, probably?
Yeah, something like that.
And it's up in the hills, the countryside, as you're saying. And they end up moving and settling in Trenchtown, which is a rather poor area of Kingston, is it not?
It was a decent area at that time, and we're talking late 50s. Trenchtown wasn't the ghetto that it would become certainly within 10 years, if not sooner.
Mm-hmm. So this is now in the late 50s, I guess we're talking about. And what I'd love you to set the scene for, because you've done some extensive writing on these eras and obviously the Caribbean, Jamaica, etc. Describe the music scene in Jamaica in the 50s and early 60s. And I guess also the other force that's happening along with music is the pre-independence feelings, where Jamaica is wanting to assert its independence from, obviously, the British Crown.
Well, the music that Bob and Bunny would be listening to mainly came from America, because there were stations in the southern states that could be picked up on Jamaican radio. Jamaica only had one real radio station, which was a BBC cable service called Rediffusion. And they played mainly British pop music and very little, if any, local music. It was very limited. So
a very colonial approach, it sounds like.
Absolutely, because it was still colonial before 1962. And some people would argue for long after that. But so the main influence was coming from America, and it was a time of post rock and roll, American rhythm and blues. So you'd have people like Fats Domino, Elvis Presley, Roscoe Gordon, Louis Jordan, T-Bone Walker, these kind of people. blues and early soul mixed in with some early country and gospel, all influences that would become absorbed by reggae music eventually. But the music in Jamaica at that time, what remnants or what stirrings of a local music industry was there was mainly dealing with mento, which was almost like a form of Jamaican folk music, a bit similar to the calypso coming from Trinidad. And I think, as you mentioned, independence, there must have been a feeling of real excitement in the air, that Jamaica was at last coming into its own. They were taking back control. They were building new airports and new buildings were going up. And it was this sense of opportunity in the air. And so that would have been very inspiring to musicians and young singers.
I guess what occurs is there's kind of an evolution in the sound from the R&B and the Fats Dominoes, etc., that they were kind of importing to sort of the ska sound. Was that just changing the beat on the offbeat? Like, how did that sort of evolution happen?
Some people have told me, well, they tried to play rhythm and blues, but it just came out Jamaican.
Right.
And so whether it was deliberate or not, we don't know, but they came up with a variation called ska that spread like wildfire, but it was a dance, before it was a genre, it was a dance. And just like in America and in Britain, actually, young people went to these sound systems to dance, and every new dance that came along would find a ready audience, and ska certainly did that. The first music from Jamaica to have an international impact, Simmer Down, it was certainly their debut hit, and it came out in 1964, the summer of 1964, and apparently it sold very well and put the Wailers on the map. By the time that first album came out, the music had changed. It was no longer ska by that stage. It was rock steady. And so the music on it, with the exception of Put It On and Rude Boy, didn't really reflect where the Wailers were musically.
How would you describe rock steady as a format to the audience? Would that be Dandy Livingston, Rudy, A Message to You, or is that ska?
No, that's rock steady. The beat slowed down, and because ska was very up tempo, and people got fed up of it, I think, after a couple of years, and there was such a profusion of ska releases as well that I'm sure to a lot of the audience they tired of it.
I think a lot of us modern audiences think of reggae as this eternal thing in Jamaica, but really what you've painted the picture of is the almost the archaeology of it all, which starts with the R&B from the States. It starts with the soul music from the States, the imported records that were effectively played on the radio stations that were very colonial in their views. And then, of course, it adapts and adopts to ska via the, like you said, the Scatolites and rock steady ultimately. So we're not even at the reggae kind of formation point yet.
No.
And we're talking about Bob Marley. So it's an interesting, I think, education for our audience to hear that. Let's flip back to Bob the person. And in 1965-66, a couple of things happen. Bob marries Rita, his wife. Rita would ultimately become part of Bob's band as a backup singer.
But then they got married in February 1966, just before he went to visit his mother, because Bob's mother had moved to Delaware, to Wilmington.
And so he ended up going, I guess, living with his mother and her new family, and
Yeah,
then working in factories in the US.
indeed. Yes, he did, to raise some money, because the objective was to start his own record label so the Wailers could be independent and leave Coxon. He went off in February 1966.
Next, we will dive with John into the beginnings of Bob Marley's transformation to Rastafarianism. But first, some background on the Rastafari religion and how it came to Jamaica. To do so, we have to go back to the 1920s. Marcus Garvey was a Jamaican who advocated for blacks during that decade. His view, John, was that Jamaicans were former slaves who'd had British and colonial traditions placed on them in terms of culture, religion, and politics, and they deserved to have their own beliefs and structures.
Look, we can only imagine how significant Rastafari would have been for the descendants of people who had endured slavery and who had lived under colonial rule for so very long. Their descendants had been stripped of everything that really makes a human being. Their names, their families, their land, their history, their beliefs, their culture, their futures. They were literally stripped of everything, and they were given a white Christian faith, which didn't sit well with the young rebels of the Wailers era.
And so, way back in the 1920s, as we mentioned, Garvey urged Black Jamaicans to educate themselves and practice self-reliance. He also said that Blacks should look eastward for a Black king, since the Western world had polluted the minds of slaves and stolen their African traditions. This led to a small minority of Jamaican Blacks looking to Ethiopia for hope of a Black king, since Ethiopia had never been colonized by any of the Western European powers. In 1930, Emperor Haile Selassie was crowned in Ethiopia, and for impoverished and social disenfranchised Afro-Jamaicans, this was a sign that the Black king that Marcus Garvey had prophesied had been fulfilled. This small group of Afro-Jamaicans started the Rastafari religion in the 1930s. The name Rastafari actually came from the Ethiopian emperor's original name and title, which was three names: Ras, Tafari, Makanen.
Yeah, he could trace his lineage back to King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba.
Wow.
It was that significant.
But from 1930 in colonial Jamaica, Rastafarians were outcasts living in the hills and remote areas and smoking ganja, Jamaican slang for marijuana. Ganja was a sacred sacrament to the Rastafarians. However, a turning point for the small minority of Rastafarians came in the form of a state visit from the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie in 1966 to Jamaica, while Bob was still in the U.S.
But the real action was happening in Jamaica with Rita, Bunny, and Peter, because they witnessed Emperor Haile Selassie's visit. And it had a profound influence on them in Bob's absence.
Bob returns to Jamaica.
He returned to Jamaica, and Peter and Rita and Bunny were full of Selassie's visit. And they began going to Rasta gatherings in Trenchtown. And
so this would have been in the 67, 68 sort of time period that they were in at that point.
That's absolutely correct.
And what's interesting is obviously the appetite for Bob and Peter and Bunny and Rita to really soak up this knowledge really starts to infuse the direction of where well, certainly Bob heads relative to political activism, knowledge, insight, spirituality.
Yes.
It's really an incredible sort of evolution.
They had a big hit with Lee Perry with Duppy Conqueror in 1970. They also um, got together with Perry's backing band, the Upsetters, with the Barrett brothers, the bass player Aston Family Man Barrett and his brother Colton on the drums. The combination of the Wailers' vocal arrangements and the Barrett brothers' rhythm section really gelled, and they actually changed the face of reggae music, because they came up with that very sticky one drop sound, which became a definitive part of reggae music internationally after that.
Next, John will tell us about a key turning point in Bob Marley and the Wailers' ascension to fame. They were signed by Island Records, an international record label headed up by a white Jamaican named Chris Blackwell. Blackwell had his own roots in globally distributing early Jamaican recordings in ska and rocksteady in the 1960s. And under his label, Island, the Wailers began the journey to stardom. So Chris Blackwell steps in, John, and then ultimately finances the first Marley and the Wailers album.
Yes, that's right. That was Catch a Fire. So they went back to Jamaica. They recorded Catch a Fire, and that became their debut album on Island Records.
Catch a Fire, of course, contains the hit Stir It Up.
It's regarded as a classic now, but it really didn't sell too much at the time. But it was a marker. That album was a marker. And what was significant about it was the use of lead guitar overdubs on some of the songs, which really resonated with a rock audience. And that was pivotal. Bob wanted to hear what a rock style lead guitar would sound like. You see, I think the thing to remember is that when you look at Bob Marley at that time, he had long hair. He smoked weed. He liked girls. He was a rebel. He played guitar. He wore denim. I mean, this is that you could be describing a rock star of the early 70s. He fitted that format.
Chris Blackwell saw that persona, I think, and sort of thought this could be the star of this band.
Absolutely. That's who he wanted to spearhead this new form of reggae music, which could appeal to an international audience made up primarily of rock fans at that time.
The next album comes out called Burnin', October 73. Songs, things like Get Up, songs like Get Up, Stand Up, I Shot the Sheriff. Would you say the political elements are being turned up a little bit on this album?
Yeah, and I think that came from confidence. Yeah, this is what they had in them. This is what they had to offer. And Get Up, Stand Up was later adopted by Amnesty International as their anthem. And it was Peter and Bob Marley. They both sang on that record.
I guess we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the Jamaican political situation at that time. You've got a left-leaning government, the CIA rumored to be advocating change to put a pro-business government in. Can you speak a little bit about the political climate that was really having an impact on the people, on the ground in Jamaica?
Yeah, and the Wailers played their part in getting that left-wing prime minister elected, Michael Manley. Certainly, there was proven CIA involvement in trying to destabilize Manley's government by the end.
Yeah, they were. I mean, I've read that they were supplying guns to gangs in the streets that sort of were against Manley. Is that fair to say?
It was, and yet the reason why a lot of Rastafarian artists in Jamaica, and not just Bob Marley and Peter Tosh, um, had a fondness, if you like, or lean towards Michael Manley was because he did things which we don't hear about as often. Free literacy classes all across the island where people who couldn't read and write could go and have lessons and learn to do those things. Women's rights, children's rights. There were a lot of good things happening in Jamaica at that time, but the opposition to Manley and his ambitions was unprecedented, really.
I was going to get into album 5 here, the Natty Dread album.
No, the first thing to say about that album was that it was Bob Marley's first solo album, because Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer had actually left by then. The Wailers' 2-album deal with Island Records had finished, and Chris Blackwell signed Bob Marley essentially as a solo act. But he transposed the name Wailers to his backing musicians, which were still centered around the Barrett brothers.
So how did that go down with Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston? Like, how did they, or Bunny Wailer, as he ultimately changed his name to, how did that go over, that split?
Well, I don't think they liked Chris Blackwell. I think they felt that Chris Blackwell favored Bob Marley. I think they felt that Bob Marley had betrayed them in various ways. But they also had ambitions of being name artists in their own right. And they certainly had the talent to achieve that. And they went on to prove that.
Is there any truth to the fact that Bob Marley went by Bob Marley because he was influenced by Bob Dylan? Or is that just an urban myth?
No, absolutely. I think the influence of Bob Dylan, a lot of Jamaicans wouldn't like to admit that, but his influence on some of those Jamaican artists is unmistakable. I mean, the Wailers themselves covered a couple of Bob Dylan songs when they were at Studio One. So, because he changed the whole notion of songwriting. Even the Beatles were heavily influenced by him. Lyrics with meaning and power and nuance.
Absolutely. We did a recent show on Bob Dylan, and that certainly came through. He changed the game for the Beatles and everyone that followed. Songs with meaning replaced songs about twisting and shouting and the rest of it. So would have had an impact on pretty much globally, as you said. Let's get to Bob Marley's personality at this point, because I think there's elements of his personal life that are misunderstood, overlooked. Like, how does it contribute to sort of our knowledge of the man? Tell us about Bob the man here. What's he like, his personality?
Bob was very driven, very disciplined. He had a ferocious work ethic. He was renowned for insisting upon rigorous rehearsals. And so, yes, perfectionist, I would say so. I think what he was driven by was this need to communicate issues he thought were extremely important, Rastafari being one of them. He was driven, as were the band members, of spreading the gospel of Rastafari as far and as wide as possible, and also the reggae genre, because he knew that if he could popularize the reggae genre, then the whole economy of Jamaica and the people in Jamaica would lift as a result of that. And I think that was very, very important to him. The rising of his people, the well-being of his people, was very important.
It's interesting you say that because, when you compare him to Bob Dylan, or at least to Dylan having influence on anybody, including Marley, Dylan had his early protest sort of period where he wrote a lot about, the society of the early 60s in the US and the injustices, etc. But then sort of Bob evolved into this sort of, these lyrics that were almost, they were fantastical, but Bob Marley kept going with the political activism in his songs. It's an incredible legacy that he just kept pushing that agenda. And you said trying to uplift his people. I mean, that's something really special.
Absolutely. And I think that was absolutely core to his mission as a musician.
In 1976, John, we start moving to some impacts or sort of implications, let's call them, of Bob's increasing political visibility as a symbol of to his citizens, and something violent occurs.
1976 was the year that Prime Minister Michael Manley declared a national state of emergency, an indefinite state of emergency in Jamaica. Things had got that bad. Marley was writing songs like Who the Cat Fit, Crazy Bald Head, Johnny Was, about a mother mourning her son who died through gun violence. It's serious.
Like songs like War, Rat Race.
Absolutely. The Rastaman Vibration album. And so he was putting it all out there in 1976, and Jamaican society was in turmoil, essentially. The middle classes were fleeing. They were leaving the island in droves. There were rumors that Manley was turning Jamaica into a communist country, fueled no doubt by the CIA and American business interests and the rival party, the JLP. And then towards the end of the year, Marley wanted to give a free concert in Kingston called Smile Jamaica. He wanted to put a smile on people's faces. He wanted to lift people's spirits. And he did a song called Smile Jamaica, which was pretty lightweight, but pretty, likable. And I'm sure he had all the right intentions, except that in order to stage a free concert in the National Heroes Park in Jamaica, you need permission of the government, of course. And the government, the Prime Minister's officers, designed and printed the posters with the Prime Minister's office printed clearly on the posters. And look as if Bob Marley was endorsing the PMP. And this was very dangerous in such a volatile atmosphere. This was very dangerous. He was warned not to do the show. Bob Marley said, tell these people making these threats that I turn the other cheek. I mean, he just was going ahead with this, even though he was aware of the confusion that this was causing. And as soon as the date of the show, December the 5th, 1976, was announced, Michael Manley declared that the election would take place, just a week or so afterwards. So it really did look like this concert was a pre-election boost for Manley.
Yeah, almost a campaign stop or a campaign element, at least.
Absolutely. And so 2 days before the show was due to take place, gunmen went into 56 Hope Road, Marley's...
Which is Bob's home.
That's right. And the Wailers were rehearsing in a back room, and the gunmen poked their guns through the door and just fired indiscriminately. Thankfully, rather than take aim, they were clearly nervous, and they just fired indiscriminately, and they wounded Bob, Rita, and the manager, Don Taylor, and another person who worked on the premises. But fortunately, no one was killed. But eyewitnesses have told me that Bob Marley was really shaken up by this. He genuinely believed that the people of Jamaica, who he loved so much, he couldn't believe that they would turn against him.
And he ended up, obviously he survives. He was shot, I think, in the arm, but he plays the concert anyways. Following the assassination attempt, Marley leaves Jamaica. He goes to London. Why does he go there? What was the reasoning? Safety?
Safety, yes, probably. It was also where Island Records were based, and they had a new studio. And it was also that his girlfriend, Cindy Breakspear, had recently been crowned Miss World. And
she was from Jamaica. She was from Jamaica, is that correct?
Yeah. That's right. She was a tenant at 56 Hope Road. And they were together when she was crowned Miss World. And after the shooting, they went to Nassau for a couple of weeks with some of the musicians. And then she went off to do her promotion as Miss World, and he went to London and started work on the Exodus and Kaya albums. The sound that was created on the Exodus album is more international than you can hear on any previous Bob Marley release. So this was a real step up for him. And then he was writing, inspired by Cindy Breakspear, he was writing some absolutely beautiful love songs, such as Waiting in Vain. And then something like Three Little Birds, which was just had hit written all over it, as well as crowd pleasers like Exodus and Jamming. I mean, Exodus really had everything on that album. The future looked bright, and he went into Europe to do some European dates. The first date was in Paris. He played football during a break, as he normally did, and injured his toe playing football. He'd gone to a doctor about his toe injury and been diagnosed with melanoma cancer. He was told to choose between toe or tore, and basically he had to take time off.
Unfortunately, it just escalated and got worse, which we'll get to in a minute. But there's a seminal point. I mean, he puts out another album, Kaya, March 78, with Is This Love? And Exodus, it's a great transition, opens with a warning. Quote, many more will have to suffer. Many more will have to die. Don't ask me why. Things are not the way they used to be, is Marley's quote there. Again, the violence is still happening. The paramilitary groups affiliated with these two parties are still killing each other. Like, it's still bad times, obviously. Which leads us up to really him wanting to return. But there's the return to Jamaica, a hero once again. And there's an extraordinary return of Marley. He returns for the another political concert, the One Love Peace concert. And I guess, again, in an effort to sort of calm these warring factions. Do you want to tell us about the extraordinary thing that he has happen at that concert relative to peacemaking?
He would headline a One Love Peace concert to actually celebrate and solidify the peace. But the moment when he invited the two political heads onto the stage with him, the prime minister and the leader of the opposition, and he joined their hands above his head and looked forward and chanted, "Ja Rastafari." I mean, that was probably the most iconic moment in reggae history and of Marley's entire career. And that is what we all remember from that concert. That became immortal.
Very powerful moment. The album 8, which is, I guess, Bob's final studio album, has Could You Be Loved, which is a great tune, but the Redemption song is a very poignant one, and that might be one of the last songs you recorded. Is that fair to say?
Yes, possibly. This may sound a bit controversial, but I knew his keyboard player, Earl Wire Lindo, pretty well. And there were rumors that he'd written Redemption song. And I asked Wire if that were true. And he said yes, he did write it, but he'd given the song to Bob because he was the singer and he didn't want to make any fuss. It's
a beautiful song.
Yeah.
And the acoustic version is just so powerful. What is Bob Marley's legacy, John? Where does his place in music history, where will we look back and say, Bob Marley, wow, he was what will we say about his place in musical history?
He has come to symbolize the whole of reggae music, the style of reggae music, the nature of reggae music, the philosophical and spiritual backbone of reggae music, what it represents. He is the epitome of all those qualities that we now associate with reggae music. Anyone from anywhere creating a reggae song will be compared to him. Absolutely.
When we look at Dylan, we think of his influence on the Beatles, Bruce Springsteen, Neil Young, anyone that followed sort of wrote these very powerful songs. Who did Bob Marley directly influence, do you think? Who kind of can trace their lineage to Marley's approach and the Wailers?
I've interviewed many hundreds of reggae and dancehall artists from Jamaica and all over the world. And if I ask them who they were inspired by and who they look up to, I would say 95% of them mention Bob Marley in the first sentence.
That says a lot.
Absolutely. And that's hardcore dancehall artists as well as traditional reggae artists. And then you have all the non-reggae artists who've been inspired by him also. Truly an international figure. It's, I think in terms of importance, he must be one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century. He would be right up there with anyone else you care to mention. And we've recently seen the film, One Love movie that's come out. And
what did you think? What did you think of the movie?
I loved it, and it's the storyline was hopelessly confused. It was a love story about he and Rita, and if they'd have set that love story in the 60s and the very early 70s, it would have been beautiful. But they set it from 76 onwards, when clearly the big love interest in his life at that time was Cindy Breakspears, who wasn't mentioned in the film.
Right.
So, so that's pretty inexcusable. But I never thought I would see the day when I went to a mainstream cinema and the whole audience was singing along to these songs. And it was a film about a ganja smoking Rasta artist from a Jamaican slum. I mean, really.
Right. If he were still alive, have you ever thought about what he would have done in the ensuing years?
I asked Family Man this, and he told me that they were preparing to go back to their roots and make Nyabingi music. Nyabingi is the traditional Rasta music, which is based on drums and chanting. And as they did on Rasta Man Chant from the Burning album. But they may well have done that. But a friend of mine went down to Jamaica one time to interview Marley, and he was intently listening to Saturday Night Fever soundtrack by the Beatles. and when my friend said, "What are you doing?" he said, "Well, this album sold millions of copies. I want to know why." He wanted to sell records, and what we have to remember is that up until the time he died, he'd never had a hit in America. Not one. Not with black audiences, not with white audiences. And
right.
Eric Clapton had taken I Shot the Sheriff to number one in America, but Bob Marley himself couldn't get anywhere near the Billboard 100. So
right.
I think that would have been a real mission of his.
And he probably would have pulled it off too.
I think he would.
At the end of the show, we always ask our guests to come up with 3 picks of songs that the audience should give a listen to.
Simmer Down, because it's so exuberant and life-giving. It's what a debut hit. What a debut hit. You know, and the fact that it was inspired by warring ghetto gangs and telling them to cool it down, but it was so uplifting and so joyous at the same time. It was just a magical record. I can imagine hearing it on a jukebox, you know, as you walk down a road in Kingston, and it would just have knocked you for 6. So that's one. Rebel Music, 3 O'Clock Roadblock. That's just a hymn to freedom. I mean, why can't we roam this open country? You know, why can't we be what we want to be? And the way he describes being stopped by the police, and he knows he's going to be asked for his documents and maybe searched for ganja. And to me, it will forever symbolize what it's like to live in an authoritarian society. It's brilliant. I love it, musically as well. And
it really that, you know, that theme really sets the stage for, you know, bands like NWA and others who really start to write about, you know, corrupt cops and racism and much later. But boy, Marley and crew were on this early, obviously, because of their own troubles locally that they had or faced.
Yeah. And he loved associating himself, casting himself as an outlaw. He did it on I Shot the Sheriff. And, you know, he did it in that song as well. I think that was a favorite technique, if you can call it, of his. And the other one would be Redemption Song, which is so profound. And he says none of them can stop the time. In other words, you know, what will be will be. It's the ultimate expression of faith, really.
Well, your passion certainly shines through, and I want to thank you for chronicling these
Mm.
genres of music. It's important work, and you've done it brilliantly.
Thank
John's authored Pressure Drop, Reggae in the 70s, Simmer Down, Early Wailers Story, The Story of Bob Marley's Wailers, Wailing Blues, and several other books on the genre.
you.
So, again, thank you for chronicling such an important genre, and we've thoroughly enjoyed having you here today.
Thank you, Dave. It's been a pleasure. And I love your podcast, and more health and strength and power in what you do.
Likewise. Thank you so much, John, for coming on.
Thank you.
Today, guest John Masouri talked about the box office smash movie about Bob, which grossed $160 million, called One Love. The movie is also fueling the sales of his music catalog, helping him achieve the 150 million sales mentioned at the top of our episode. He ranks number 34 among all-time bestsellers, in the same league as the Beach Boys or Bob Dylan. The posthumous album of Bob Marley's, called Legend, was released in 1984 and contained some of his greatest hits. It went on to become the best-selling reggae album of all time, with more than 12 million copies sold worldwide. In 1994, Bob was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame along with Elton John, John Lennon, and Rod Stewart. Why did Bob Marley and his friends Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer use the term Wailers as a band name? The word Wailers was a reference to their social and economic position in Trenchtown in Kingston, Jamaica, as, quote, ghetto sufferers born wailing, unquote. In June 1978, Marley was given the United Nations Peace Medal of the Third World at a ceremony in New York. It was presented by African delegates in recognition of Marley's efforts on behalf of millions of disenfranchised Black people around the world. A further example of Marley's standing as a global political force was the fact that he was asked to appear at a concert in Zimbabwe, the former Rhodesia, in celebration of that nation's independence from Britain in 1980. Marley ranks at number 5 on the Forbes list of top earning dead celebrities, with his estate pulling in more than $20 million a year, more than the likes of Prince, Marilyn Monroe, and John Lennon. Bob was diagnosed with cancer in the form of melanoma in his toe. Doctors said one option was to amputate the toe or even the foot to eliminate future cancer risks. Many have speculated that because of Marley's Rasta religious beliefs, he did not opt for the amputation, since the Rasta religion prohibits cutting into the skin. Marley opted for an alternative cancer treatment, was being treated in Germany, and when it became apparent it wasn't helping, he decided to return to Jamaica to end his days. Sadly, Marley never made the full journey from Germany to Jamaica and died en route in Miami in May of 1981. Marley was buried in his homeland along with a soccer ball, his Gibson Les Paul guitar, and a bud of marijuana. The members of the original Wailers groups are sadly no longer with us. Bunny Wailer passed away in March 2021 from complications from a stroke. He was 73 years old when he died. Peter Tosh was tragically killed during a home invasion in 1987. For more on Bob Marley and the Wailers' career, visit garagetostadiums.com, where you can see our bonus coverage of the group, which includes video clips and historical memorabilia. You can see our notes and transcripts from all of our episodes at the site. We've made it easy for you to build a killer playlist for every performer featured on a Garage to Stadium episode, including a playlist on today's band, Bob Marley and the Wailers. Find the link to the Apple and Spotify playlist in our bonus coverage section of our website. Follow our show on your favorite podcast platform to be alerted when our next episode drops. We'd love it if you'd provide a review for the show on your favorite podcast platform. We hope you enjoyed our show today. Special thanks to our guest, John Masouri, author of Simmer Down, and also thanks to our producers, Amina Faubert, Connor Sampson, and our program director, Scott Campbell. You've been listening to Garage to Stadiums, another Blast Furnace Labs production. I'm Dave Anthony. See you next time for another Garage to Stadium story.